The day Iran crossed the line. The modern Islamic Republic of Iran has survived decades of sanctions, wars by proxy, assassinations, cyber attacks, and internal dissent. But every authoritarian system has a breaking point, a moment when repression no longer stabilizes power, but instead accelerates collapse. According to mounting international outrage and unprecedented diplomatic warnings, Iran may have just crossed that line. What began as protests fueled by economic despair and political suffocation has now transformed into something far more dangerous. A global confrontation triggered by the mass killing of civilians. When people protested, security forces responded with arrests, intimidation, internet shutdowns. The regime calculated that fear would always outpace anger. But this time, the scale was different. The response was broader, harsher, and far more lethal, but with live ammunition, mass detentions, and military-style crackdowns, as Tehran claimed. They were the result of years of accumulated pressure. Inflation crushing families, youth unemployment soaring, corruption hollowing out institutions, and a political system that allows no peaceful path for reform. What made this wave unique was its persistence and its diversity. Workers, students, women, ethnic minorities, and even former regime loyalists took to the streets. The chants were no longer about policy changes. They were about legitimacy, dignity, and survival. As demonstrations spread, the regime made a fateful decision. Instead of de-escalation, it escalated. Instead of dialogue, it deployed elite security units. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, long the regime's shield against internal threats, moved decisively. Entire neighborhoods were sealed off, communications were cut, reports emerged of coordinated raids, nighttime arrests, and deadly force used against unarmed crowds. While exact numbers remain contested, independent observers, human rights organizations, and leaked information suggest the death toll reached into the thousands. This was not merely a crackdown, it was a message, not only to Iranians, but to the world. The regime was signaling that it would rather rule over silence and graves than risk losing control. But this message landed very differently outside Iran's borders. Images, testimonies, and digital evidence spread rapidly despite censorship. Governments that had previously hesitated to confront Tehran directly found themselves under public pressure to respond. Among those watching closely was the United States. For Washington, Iran has always been a strategic puzzle, too powerful to ignore, too dangerous to trust, and too entrenched to topple easily. Over the years, U.S. policy oscillated between pressure and engagement, sanctions and negotiations. Nuclear talks came and went. When a state openly slaughters its own citizens, it becomes harder for foreign powers to justify restraint. American officials began using unusually blunt language. Statements from Washington emphasized not only Iran's nuclear ambitions or regional aggression, but the killing of civilians. This shift was significant. It reframed Iran not just as a geopolitical adversary, but as a regime committing crimes that demanded consequences. In diplomatic terms, this is a dangerous transition because it narrows the space for compromise. Behind closed doors, strategic calculations intensified. The U.S. military already maintained a significant presence in the Middle East. Naval assets, air bases, and regional partnerships provided the infrastructure for rapid escalation if ordered. While no official declaration of military action was made, signals were unmistakable. Warnings grew sharper, deadlines were implied. The language of deterrence began to resemble the language of ultimatum. Iran, for its part, appeared defiant. Officials denied responsibility, blamed foreign agitators, and accused Western intelligence agencies of orchestrating unrest. Struggled to absorb the shock of unrest. Even within the ruling elite, reports suggested unease. History shows that authoritarian systems are most vulnerable, not when protesters fill the streets, but when insiders begin to doubt the leadership's ability to maintain control. Internationally, Iran's position deteriorated rapidly. European governments, long cautious about confrontation, took unprecedented steps against key Iranian institutions. Diplomatic isolation deepened. Regional actors recalculated their stance, watching closely to see whether Iran was entering a phase of irreversible decline or preparing for a violent external diversion to restore internal unity. This is where the idea of Revenge Day began to circulate in political commentary and media narratives, not as an official label, but as a symbol of looming retaliation. Powerful states eventually respond, not out of compassion alone. The concern in Washington was not just about human rights, it was about precedent. Allowing such actions to go unanswered could embolden not only Iran, but other authoritarian governments watching closely. Yet escalation carries enormous risks. A direct confrontation between the United States and Iran would not be a contained conflict. It would ripple across the Middle East, disrupt global energy markets, and potentially draw in multiple regional and global actors. Proxy forces, long nurtured by Tehran, could activate across several countries. Cyber retaliation could target critical infrastructure. The line between punishment and full-scale war would be dangerously thin. This is the paradox now facing U.S. decision-makers. Respond too softly, and credibility erodes. Respond too harshly, and the region could ignite. Iran's leadership is betting that Washington understands these risks and will hesitate. The United States is betting that Iran underestimates its willingness to act when a line is crossed too publicly and too brutally. Meanwhile, inside Iran, the human cost continues to rise. Families mourn in silence. Communities are traumatized. Fear competes with rage. History suggests that mass repression can delay change, but rarely eliminates it. Instead, it transforms protest movements, making them more determined, more radicalized, and more willing to endure suffering for the possibility of a different future. The question now is not whether Iran has entered a dangerous phase. The question is whether this phase ends with internal transformation, external confrontation, or a combination of both. As global powers posture and threats harden, the space for peaceful resolution shrinks. Part 1 ends at this critical moment, a moment where Iran stands isolated, the United States signals resolve. What happens next will determine not only the fate of Iran's protesters, but the balance of power in an already fragile region. Washington's calculus and Tehran's gamble. If Part 1 was about the moment Iran crossed a moral and political line, Part 2 is about what happens next. Inside the war rooms, intelligence briefings, and closed-door meetings where consequences are calculated, not shouted. History shows that global confrontations rarely begin with a single decision. They emerge from a sequence of signals, misread intentions, and strategic gambles. The confrontation between the United States and Iran is now deep inside that dangerous sequence. In Washington, the debate is no longer theoretical. The mass killing of protesters changed the framing of Iran from a difficult adversary to an urgent problem. For years, U.S. Policymakers argued about nuclear enrichment levels, missile ranges, and proxy networks. Now, human rights abuses are no longer a background issue. They are front and center. This matters because it reshapes domestic politics. American leaders operate under public scrutiny, and images of repression abroad can quickly turn restraint into political liability. Inside the U.S. administration, several options are on the table. Expanded sanctions are the least risky, but also the least impactful in the short term. Iran has already adapted to economic pressure, and additional restrictions may hurt civilians more than decision makers. Diplomatic isolation is symbolically powerful, but symbols alone do not stop bullets or dismantle security forces. The most serious option, direct or indirect military action, carries consequences that could last a generation. Military planners approach Iran differently than other adversaries. Iran is not weak, but it is not conventionally dominant either. Its strength lies in asymmetry. Proxies, missiles, drones, cyber capabilities, and geographic leverage over critical shipping routes. Any U.S. strike, even a limited one, would trigger responses that are deliberately difficult to trace or contain. This is why Washington speaks in warnings rather than timelines. At the same time, credibility is everything. U.S. power is not only measured by weapons, but by whether threats are believed. If Washington draws a line and fails to enforce it, the damage extends far beyond Iran. Allies question commitments. Rivals test boundaries elsewhere. This is why language matters. When American leaders say they are watching closely, or that all options remain on the table, these are not casual phrases. They are signals sent not only to Tehran, but to Moscow, Beijing, and every capital calculating future risks. From Tehran's perspective, survival depends on appearing unbreakable. The regime believes that hesitation is weakness, and that fear, once lost, must be restored through overwhelming force. This belief is rooted in the system's origins. The Islamic Republic was forged in revolution and war. When protests erupted, the leadership concluded that restraint would invite more defiance, not less. Yet Iran's gamble is far more dangerous than it appears. Internally, repression is not cost-free. Each act of violence erodes loyalty, even among those tasked with enforcing order. Security forces are not immune to doubt. They have families, economic struggles, and access, however limited, to information. Sustaining mass repression requires cohesion, and cohesion weakens when outcomes remain uncertain. If protests subside temporarily, but economic conditions worsen, the regime faces a cycle of unrest with diminishing tools to control it. Externally, Iran's actions narrowed its diplomatic options. Countries that once advocated engagement now struggle to justify dialogue. Even states traditionally sympathetic to Iran's anti-Western stance are wary of instability. No government wants to be associated with mass repression that could provoke war. As Iran's isolation deepens, its dependence on a smaller circle of partners increases, reducing strategic flexibility. This is where the risk of miscalculation becomes acute. Iran may believe that the United States will ultimately avoid confrontation, fearing regional chaos. The United States may believe that Iran will eventually step back, fearing regime collapse. If both sides act on these assumptions, escalation becomes more likely, not less. History is filled with examples where leaders believed the other side would blink until neither did. Meanwhile, regional actors are not passive observers. In the Middle East, every crisis creates opportunities and dangers for neighboring states. Some view Iran's instability as a chance to weaken a long-standing rival. Others fear that collapse would unleash chaos far worse than repression. Gulf states monitor energy markets nervously, knowing that even the perception of conflict can send shockwaves through global supply chains. Israel watches closely, calculating whether Iran's internal crisis could accelerate or delay strategic threats. None of these actors control events, but all can influence them. Energy markets, often overlooked in political analysis, play a silent but powerful role. Iran sits at the heart of global oil and gas routes. Any escalation, even without direct attacks on infrastructure, increases insurance costs, disrupts shipping, and drives prices upward. This economic ripple effect reaches far beyond the Middle East, influencing inflation, elections, and social stability worldwide. In this sense, Iran's internal crackdown is no longer a domestic issue. It is a global risk factor. Inside Iran, the protest movement adapts. After the initial shock of violence, resistance rarely disappears. It evolves. Large street demonstrations may give way to smaller, decentralized actions. Labor strikes, acts of civil disobedience, and symbolic resistance replace mass rallies. These forms are harder to crush because they lack a single target. The regime understands this and responds with broader surveillance, harsher laws, and collective punishment, further alienating the population. This creates a long-term problem the regime cannot solve with force alone: legitimacy. Governments can rule through fear for a time, but legitimacy determines endurance. When citizens no longer believe the system represents them, or can even protect their basic dignity, loyalty evaporates. The state becomes something to endure, not support. This is the stage at which sudden, unexpected shifts become possible. Washington watches these internal dynamics carefully. U.S. strategy toward Iran has always involved patience, waiting for pressure to accumulate rather than forcing rapid change. But patience has limits, especially when events unfold in real time under global scrutiny. Every day that passes without accountability increases the chance that the U.S. will feel compelled to act in a visible way, if only to restore deterrence and signal resolve. Yet even among those advocating a tougher stance, there is recognition of a harsh truth. External force cannot create internal legitimacy. At best, it can alter behavior or weaken structures. At worst, it can unify a population around a besieged regime. This dilemma explains the careful balance in U.S. messaging, strong enough to deter, cautious enough to avoid becoming the regime's greatest propaganda tool. Iran's leadership, however, may be running out of time to adjust. Economic pressure, internal dissent, and international isolation are converging. Each on its own is manageable. Together, they form a strategic squeeze. The longer the regime relies solely on repression, the narrower its options become. The phrase "revenge day" captures the psychological atmosphere more than any formal policy. It reflects a growing belief that a reckoning is approaching, not necessarily on a single day, not necessarily through a single strike, but through a sequence of actions that reshape the balance of power. Whether that reckoning comes through sanctions, covert operations, diplomatic isolation, or military force remains uncertain. What is certain is that the path Iran and the United States are on is narrowing. Decisions made now, or avoided, will echo for years. As Part 2 closes, the world stands at an uneasy pause. Tehran doubles down on control while risking collapse. The question is no longer whether change is coming, but in what form and at what cost. By the time global crises reach this stage, momentum often becomes more powerful than intention. Leaders may still speak of restraint, but systems, military, economic, political, begin to move according to their own logic. The confrontation surrounding Iran is no longer confined to statements and speculation. It has entered a phase where perception, signaling, and reaction can accelerate events faster than diplomacy can slow them down. Across the world, governments have shifted from observation to preparation. Intelligence agencies reassess threat models. Even nations geographically distant from the Middle East understand what is at stake. A confrontation involving Iran and the United States would not remain regional. It would reshape global alignments, markets, and security doctrines. For the United States, the challenge is managing escalation without surrendering leverage. Washington AES strategy has increasingly relied on calibrated pressure, actions designed to warn without provoking full retaliation. This includes visible military readiness, intensified intelligence sharing with allies, and diplomatic coordination to isolate Iran politically. None of these actions are accidental. Each is meant to send a message. Escalation is possible, but avoidable, if behavior changes. Yet this approach depends on one critical assumption: that Iran's leadership is rational, unified, and capable of adjusting course. Authoritarian systems often suffer from information distortion. Leaders hear what subordinates believe they want to hear. Bad news is softened. Public anger is underestimated. External threats are exaggerated to justify internal repression. In such an environment, decision-making becomes detached from reality. Signals sent by adversaries may be misinterpreted or deliberately ignored until consequences become unavoidable. Iran's leadership operates within this risk. Publicly, officials project confidence. Privately, they face a shrinking set of options. The protest movement, though battered, has not disappeared. Economic stress continues to mount. International isolation deepens. Each day that passes without resolution increases the temptation to externalize the crisis, to shift attention outward toward confrontation rather than inward toward reform. This is where the danger of diversion becomes real. Historically, regimes under internal pressure sometimes seek external conflict to restore unity. The logic is grim but familiar. A nation under threat rallies around the flag. Dissent is framed as betrayal, and extraordinary measures become justified. Iran has used this strategy before, though usually through proxies, rather than direct confrontation. The question now is whether internal instability might push the leadership toward riskier behavior. Regional tensions amplify this risk. Iran's network of allies and affiliated groups spans several countries. These actors operate with varying degrees of autonomy, creating ambiguity that can be strategically useful or dangerously unpredictable. A single incident, misattributed or escalated by local commanders, could spiral into broader conflict. The United States understands this, which is why it treats regional flashpoints as interconnected rather than isolated. At the same time, U.S. allies face their own dilemmas. Supporting Washington strengthens deterrence, but it also exposes them to retaliation. Hosting military assets makes them targets. Aligning publicly increases domestic political pressure. As a result, many states walk a careful line, cooperating quietly while avoiding overt commitments that could inflame tensions. This cautious posture contributes to uncertainty. Uncertainty, in turn, affects markets and public opinion. Energy prices fluctuate with every rumor. Shipping routes become more expensive to insure. Investors hesitate. Ordinary people, far from the conflict zone, feel the effects through rising costs and economic anxiety. These secondary impacts influence political calculations in democratic societies, where leaders must balance foreign policy goals with domestic stability. Meanwhile, inside Iran, the psychological landscape continues to shift. Fear remains powerful, but it is no longer absolute. When repression reaches a certain intensity, it loses its deterrent effect and instead hardens resistance. Citizens adapt to danger, normalize risk, and find new ways to express defiance. This does not always produce immediate change, but it alters the social fabric. Trust in institutions collapses. Informal networks replace official structures. The state becomes something imposed, not embraced. These internal dynamics matter because they shape how Iran responds externally. A regime that feels secure behaves differently from one that feels cornered. The more threatened the leadership feels at home, the more unpredictable it may become abroad. This unpredictability is precisely what worries global powers. In Washington, analysts debate timelines rather than intentions. The question is no longer if pressure will intensify, but when and how. Some argue that prolonged tension favors the United States, whose economy and alliances are more resilient. Others warn that delay increases the risk of uncontrolled escalation. Both sides agree on one point. The current trajectory is unsustainable. Public messaging reflects this tension. Official statements emphasize restraint, legality, and international norms. Behind the scenes, planning assumes worst-case scenarios. This dual-track approach is standard in high-stakes crises, but it creates a disconnect between what the public hears and what institutions prepare for. When action finally occurs, if it does, it often appears sudden, even though it has been anticipated for months. Iran's leadership, for its part, seeks to demonstrate resilience. Military exercises, rhetorical defiance, and symbolic acts of sovereignty are designed to project strength. But projection cannot substitute for stability. Strength displayed outwardly cannot compensate for fragility within. This contradiction defines Iran's current position. The international community, fragmented as it is, still plays a role. Multilateral institutions issue condemnations. Human rights bodies document abuses. Diplomatic channels remain technically open, even if politically frozen. These mechanisms rarely produce immediate results, but they shape narratives and legitimacy. Over time, they influence how history judges actions taken, and by whom. Legitimacy matters more than many assume. In a world where power is contested not only through force, but through perception, legitimacy affects alliances, cooperation, and long-term influence. A state seen as reckless or brutal finds fewer partners willing to defend it. A state seen as hesitant or inconsistent loses deterrent credibility. Both Iran and the United States are acutely aware of this, even as they accuse each other of hypocrisy. As this phase unfolds, one truth becomes clear. No outcome will be clean. Even a resolution short of war would leave scars. Economic damage, political distrust, social trauma. A confrontation, if it occurs, would accelerate these costs exponentially. Yet doing nothing carries its own price, measured in human suffering and strategic erosion. This is the bind facing decision makers on all sides. Part 3 ends in this suspended moment, a world holding its breath, waiting to see whether signals are heeded or ignored. The machinery of power is in motion, but the final direction remains uncertain. The next phase will be decisive. The final reckoning and what comes next. Every major geopolitical crisis reaches a moment when momentum overtakes intention. Diplomats may still search for off-ramps, but the structure of events begins to harden. By this stage, choices are no longer theoretical. They are constrained by reputation, credibility, and fear of consequences. The confrontation surrounding Iran has now reached that moment. For the Iranian regime, the path forward is brutally narrow. Have stripped away much of the remaining legitimacy it once claimed. The state still controls weapons, institutions, and borders, but control is not the same as consent. A government can rule without consent for a time. Each silence hides deeper resentment. De-escalation would require acknowledging failure, admitting that violence did not restore stability. Escalation risks external retaliation and deeper isolation. Maintaining the status quo prolongs economic decline and social fracture. None of these options guarantee survival. They only delay consequences. From the perspective of the United States, the crisis tests the limits of power itself. Military strength offers leverage, but not solutions. Economic pressure can weaken a state, but not rebuild a society. Diplomatic isolation can delegitimize a regime, but it cannot by itself protect civilians. Washington's challenge is not simply how to respond to Iran, but how to do so without repeating the mistakes of past interventions that destabilized regions without delivering lasting peace. Alliances are coordinated carefully. Yet deterrence is not a permanent condition. It requires constant reinforcement, clarity, and credibility. They calculate that the United States, burdened by global responsibilities and domestic divisions, will ultimately avoid direct confrontation. History is filled with regimes that mistook patience for weakness, until it was too late. Inside Iran, the long-term consequences of the crackdown are becoming unavoidable. A generation has been politically awakened, not through ideology, but through experience. People who have seen violence used against unarmed citizens rarely forget it. Even if protests temporarily subside, memory persists. These are forces no security apparatus can permanently suppress. Economic realities reinforce this instability. Sanctions, capital flight, and internal disruption compound structural weaknesses that existed long before the protests. Opportunities shrink. The state's ability to provide even basic services comes under strain. When material survival becomes uncertain, loyalty becomes conditional. Traditional partners grow cautious. Rivals test boundaries. The Middle East, already fragile, absorbs this uncertainty like dry ground absorbs heat. Even without open war, the risk of miscalculation multiplies. A single incident, misinterpreted or mishandled, could trigger a chain reaction no one intends but everyone suffers from. Revenge, in geopolitical terms, is rarely personal. It is structural. It emerges when norms are violated repeatedly without consequence. It manifests not always through dramatic strikes, but through sustained actions that alter the balance of power and legitimacy. Yet, it is important to recognize what revenge does not mean. At best, it enforces boundaries. At worst, it deepens cycles of violence. This is why the stakes of the current crisis extend far beyond Iran and the United States. They touch the fundamental question of how the international system responds when a state turns overwhelming force inward. For ordinary Iranians, the future remains uncertain. Change, when it comes, is rarely clean or immediate. It often arrives unevenly through setbacks and unexpected turns. What is clear is that the social contract has been broken, whether it is repaired through reform, replaced through transformation, or shattered through collapse will depend on decisions made now, both inside Iran and beyond its borders. For the United States and its allies, the challenge is to align power with principle, to avoid indifference without embracing recklessness, to deter brutality without becoming its mirror. This balance is difficult, imperfect, and often criticized from all sides, but it is the only path that avoids the worst outcomes history has already documented too many times. As this chapter closes, the world does not yet know which direction events will take. What it does know is that silence is no longer possible. The killing of protesters has forced a reckoning, moral, political, and strategic. The consequences of this reckoning will unfold over months and years, not days. But the trajectory has been set. This is not just a story about Iran. It is a story about power, fear, resistance, and the limits of force. It is a reminder that regimes can suppress voices, but they cannot erase truth. And it is a warning that when repression replaces legitimacy, the future becomes unpredictable for everyone involved. History is recording, and the next decisions will define far more than headlines. If you found this analysis valuable and want more in-depth breakdowns of global power, hidden history, and geopolitical turning points, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next.